I never imagined I'd have to defend my own backyard from the very organization meant to protect our neighborhood, but that's exactly what happened when the HOA told me a portion of my land was no longer mine. They claimed it was shared property, demanded access, and hinted at fines if I didn't comply. At first I thought it was a mistake, then the letters kept coming, the pressure mounted, and that's when I realized this wasn't confusion, it was a power move. What the HOA didn't know was that I had one document that could unravel their entire claim, and when I finally revealed it, everything changed. Would it really be enough to stop them? Before any of that unfolded, life in the neighborhood was quiet in the way suburban communities always promise to be. The streets were clean, the lawns trimmed to near perfection, and the rhythm of daily life felt predictable. I had chosen this place specifically for that sense of order. It felt safe, controlled, and stable. The backyard was one of the reasons I bought the house in the first place. It wasn't extravagant, but it was private, well-defined, and felt like a small sanctuary from everything outside those fences. I spent time there without thinking twice, maintaining the grass, planning small improvements, enjoying the comfort of knowing the space belonged to me. The HOA existed in the background, mostly invisible. Occasional newsletters, reminders about trash bins, seasonal notices about lawn care, nothing unusual, nothing threatening. It was easy to believe the association functioned as advertised, quietly maintaining standards and leaving residents alone. There were subtle signs, though, that something beneath the surface wasn't quite right. Rules were written vaguely, enforcement notices sometimes appeared without explanation, neighbors whispered about fines that didn't quite make sense, but those stories always felt distant, like problems that happened to other people. I never imagined I'd become one of them. The first indication came casually, almost harmlessly. A notice appeared mentioning a review of shared spaces. It didn't name my property directly, and I barely registered it. Weeks later, another letter followed, more specific, this time referencing boundary concerns and access rights. Still, I assumed it was an administrative error. After all, property lines weren't subjective, they were recorded, measured, and legally defined. That assumption didn't last long. The HOA escalated quickly. They asserted that a portion of my backyard had always been intended for community use, citing old planning documents and internal maps. The language was confident, authoritative, and deliberately intimidating. They framed it as a correction, not a dispute, and made it clear that cooperation was expected. Resistance, they implied, would come with consequences. I pushed back gently, at first requesting clarification. Instead of answers, I received warnings. The tone shifted. What had been presented as a misunderstanding became framed as non-compliance. The association began referencing penalties, daily fines, and enforcement measures. Each communication felt heavier than the last, designed to wear me down. The pressure wasn't just administrative, it was psychological. Every email carried an undercurrent of threat, every notice suggested inevitability. They spoke as though ownership itself was flexible, as though documentation could be overridden by interpretation. It was a strategy built on exhaustion and fear, one that relied on homeowners backing down rather than pushing forward. As the weeks passed, the interference grew more aggressive. They demanded access, they questioned maintenance, they cited rules that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The backyard, once a place of calm, became a source of constant anxiety. The idea that it could simply be taken, reframed as shared, felt surreal. What made it worse was the realization that this wasn't accidental. The association wasn't confused, they were testing boundaries. They relied on ambiguity, on the assumption that most people wouldn't challenge them, and for a while it worked. Doubt crept in, questions formed. Was there something I had missed? Could they really do this? That doubt vanished the moment I began reviewing my documents. The deed was clear, the survey was precise, the property lines were unambiguous. The more I reviewed the records, the more obvious it became that the HOA's claim had no foundation, and yet they continued. That was when frustration turned into determination. The fines increased, the language sharpened, they hinted at liens, at legal action, at long-term consequences. Each step was designed to escalate the conflict without ever admitting fault. They wanted submission, not resolution. The breaking point came when they scheduled a formal hearing. It wasn't framed as an opportunity to resolve the issue, but as a procedural step toward enforcement. The implication was unmistakable. This was their arena, and they expected to win. The hearing began with an air of inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided before anyone took a seat. The HOA board members sat in a neat row, papers stacked, expressions neutral but confident. They spoke first, outlining their position with polished certainty. According to them, the issue was simple. The community's master plan, historical usage, and internal records clearly showed that part of my backyard had always been intended for shared use. They framed it as a correction, not a takeover, and presented it as an act of stewardship for the good of the neighborhood. As they spoke, the weight of their authority filled the room. They referenced policies, amendments, and interpretations that sounded official enough to intimidate anyone unfamiliar with legal nuance. Each sentence carried the implication that resistance was unreasonable, even selfish. Listening to them, it became clear how easily they expected compliance. This was not their first time pushing a homeowner to the edge. Then they escalated. They formally accused me of willful defiance. They described my refusal to grant access as obstruction. They listed the fines already accrued and hinted at future penalties that could double or triple if I continued to resist. The word lean surfaced again, spoken calmly, almost casually, as if threatening someone's home was a routine administrative step. In that moment the room felt smaller, the pressure sharper. This was the peak of their power play. When it was my turn, the tone shifted. I didn't argue emotionally, I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I laid out facts with deliberate precision. I submitted the deed, the certified survey, and the purchase agreement, each document clearly outlining the boundaries of my property. I pointed out that these were not informal papers but legally recorded instruments recognized by the county and enforceable by law. I explained how property taxes had been assessed on that land for years, paid by me, not the HOA. For a brief moment the board appeared unmoved. They countered with their own documents, older maps, scanned diagrams, internal notes. They leaned heavily on ambiguity, on language that could be interpreted in their favor. It was clear they believed confusion alone might be enough to overwhelm the truth. That's when the turning point arrived. I introduced the document they hadn't anticipated, a recorded amendment filed years before I purchased the home, one that explicitly corrected the original master plan. It clarified the exact boundary in question and transferred full ownership to the individual lot. It was signed, dated, and officially registered, not an opinion, not an interpretation, a legal fact. The room went silent. The board members leaned forward, flipping through pages, scanning dates and signatures. Their confidence faltered, replaced by something unmistakable, uncertainty. One of them asked for a recess to review the document. The request itself was revealing. For the first time, they were no longer in control of the narrative. When the hearing resumed, their tone had changed. The certainty was gone. They asked questions, now careful ones. They probed timelines, trying to find gaps, trying to salvage their position, but every attempt only reinforced the same conclusion: their claim had no legal foundation. The final blow came when my lawyer formally stated that the HOA's actions constituted overreach. He outlined potential consequences: wrongful enforcement, harassment, and the risk of legal action against the association itself. The implication was clear: if they pushed further, the tables would turn dramatically. The board exchanged glances. The power dynamic shifted visibly. What had started as an attempt to intimidate a homeowner had become a liability they could no longer ignore. They withdrew their enforcement notice. The fines were rescinded. The hearing concluded with a statement that the matter would be reconsidered, a thin attempt to save face, but the damage was done. The truth had been exposed in public and their authority had cracked under scrutiny. As I left the room, the weight I had been carrying for weeks finally began to lift. The backyard was still mine, but more importantly, the precedent was set. They could not simply claim what didn't belong to them, not quietly, not without consequence. Yet even as the immediate threat faded, one thought lingered: this wasn't just about land, it was about power and how easily it could be abused when no one pushed back. And the real question now wasn't whether the HOA would retreat, but how they would respond to having their authority challenged so publicly. The weeks following the hearing felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The HOA's sudden retreat left a noticeable void where constant emails, notices, and veiled threats had once existed. No follow-up letters arrived, no new fines appeared. The access demands stopped completely. For the first time since the dispute began, there was nothing waiting in the mailbox that made my stomach tighten. The silence wasn't just relief, it was confirmation. Their power had limits, and they had finally reached them. Soon after the official notice arrived, it was brief, carefully worded, and unmistakably cautious. The HOA acknowledged that the land in question was part of my property and that no further enforcement action would be taken regarding its use or access. They framed it as a clarification rather than an admission of fault, but the meaning was clear: the backyard was mine and their claim was over. The fines were formally erased from the record, and any reference to shared property was quietly removed from internal documentation. But the real impact went far beyond a single piece of land. Word spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped to ask questions. Some shared their own stories of warnings, citations, or pressure they had never challenged because they didn't think they could win. Others admitted they had assumed the HOA was always right simply because it sounded official. The hearing shattered that illusion. It showed that authority backed by confidence alone was fragile when confronted with facts. The HOA board itself began to change in subtle but telling ways. Meetings became shorter, more restrained. Enforcement language softened. Notices that once sounded threatening were rewritten to appear cooperative. The board members who had led the charge during my dispute were noticeably less vocal, their presence subdued. They still held positions of authority, but the unquestioned dominance they once exercised was gone. Behind the scenes, the association took steps to protect itself. Legal counsel was consulted more frequently. Policies were reviewed, not to empower the board further but to limit exposure. There was a growing awareness that aggressive enforcement carried risks: financial, reputational, and legal. The board could no longer rely on intimidation as a default strategy. They had learned the hard way that overreach could backfire. For me, the backyard became more than just a piece of land. It transformed into a symbol of resilience. Every time I stepped outside, it reminded me that standing firm mattered. The grass, the fence line, the quiet space. I had almost lost it all carried a deeper meaning now. This wasn't just where I lived, it was proof that preparation and persistence could dismantle even the most entrenched power structures. The emotional aftermath lingered longer than expected. Even after the dispute ended, there was a residual tension, a sense of vigilance that didn't disappear overnight. Power struggles leave marks, especially when they involve something as personal as one's home, but with time that tension gave way to confidence. The fear that had once accompanied every HOA notification was replaced with clarity. I knew my rights, I knew where the lines were drawn, literally and figuratively. The broader neighborhood benefited as well. Homeowners became more engaged, attending meetings they once ignored. Questions were asked openly. Requests for documentation increased. The board now under a watchful eye had to justify decisions instead of issuing them unchallenged. Transparency wasn't suddenly perfect, but it improved noticeably. The culture shifted from blind compliance to cautious awareness. The most telling moment came months later when a similar dispute surfaced involving another homeowner. This time the HOA approached it differently. There were no threats, no immediate fines. Instead, there was discussion, verification, and consultation. The shadow of the previous confrontation loomed large, shaping behavior without needing to be mentioned. The lesson had been absorbed. Looking back, it became clear how easily the situation could have gone the other way. Without documentation, without patience, without the willingness to push back, the outcome might have been very different. Many homeowners lose battles like this not because they are wrong but because they are overwhelmed. The system often relies on that imbalance, on the assumption that individuals will fold under pressure. Challenging that assumption changed everything. The experience also exposed a deeper truth about organizations like HOAs. While they are designed to maintain order and protect property values, they are still made up of people capable of bias, error, and misuse of authority. Structure alone doesn't guarantee fairness. Accountability does, and accountability only exists when someone is willing to demand it. In the end, the resolution wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no apology, no public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, there was something more enduring, a shift in power. The HOA learned restraint, the neighborhood learned awareness, and I learned that standing up for what's right doesn't always require confrontation, it requires resolve. The backyard remained unchanged physically, but everything around it had transformed. The lines on the survey matched the lines in reality. Once again, ownership wasn't just restored, it was reaffirmed, and with that came a sense of peace that no fine or notice could ever take away. The story didn't end with a victory speech or a celebration. It ended quietly with a reclaimed sense of control, and maybe that's the most powerful outcome of all, because when authority is questioned and truth prevails, it doesn't just resolve a dispute, it reshapes the balance for everyone involved. So the question that lingers isn't whether the HOA crossed a line, it's how many times lines like that go unchallenged simply because no one thinks they can push back. And if one deed could change everything here, how many other stories are waiting for someone to stand their ground?